Drops it to the end zone. Caught. Touchdown. Marvin Harrison Jr. making a huge impact.
Here's Edwards with the lane. Donovan Edwards down the sideline. Gets past Ransom. Donovan Edwards. Touchdown, Michigan.
It's time to fire it up. This is the CFF Site's Week 5 podcast. I'm your host, Joe DeSalvo, the voice of the CFF Site. And we got a lot of names to discuss again. Here we go. And I'm going to run down, open it up, and just tell you guys from Austin Reed to Dillon Gabriel. We're going to talk about the Michigan backfield situation, the Tennessee backfield situation, Washington State wide receivers, Colorado freshman receiver Amarion Miller, Terrell Vaughn, wide receiver Utah State. The list goes on and on. There's a lot to get to this week. And what I did last week is I took a bunch of questions coming in from all of you guys on the Discord. And so what I'm going to do this week is that's where I'm going to start. I'm going to use everything that you gave me. I went in there earlier today, made a post. Is there any questions that you guys want to address? And I think a lot of the questions that came in were good. I think it's going to address a lot of college fantasy rosters out there. And whatever I don't address in the questions, I've got a list of names here in front of me. I'm going to go over, and that's what we're going to do. But look, here's the deal, guys. We're coming up on week 6. I thought last week was a real pivotal week. We're really coming out of those non-conference schedules, getting into the heart of the conference schedules now. What we're faced with is that we're into week 6, and we're halfway through the season now, halfway through the college fantasy football season. And really, at this particular point, I almost feel like what you see is what you get. I felt last week was a real pivotal week for a number of players. And I'm going to touch on some of those names. We're going to circle back. Some I stand, some I'm gonna back what I said last week, and there's some that there might be one or two where I'm pivoting back, and week 5 did make a difference, and I have a different take, mainly on Kentucky running back Ray Davis. I'll get to that when we get to his name as well. But what you see, I think, is what you get from this point on. I mean, a lot of even one of the questions we'll talk about the Western Kentucky offense. I do think there's some concern there. I'll tell you what I think, what I'm seeing from that offense. And we'll go right down the list. So, let's start. Let's start at the top. And Large Arge 21 threw in a bunch of questions to start off the Discord chat earlier in the day. And his first question, is it time to dump Say Bangura, Ohio running back? And here's the deal. I don't think you can. I think this would have been a real pivotal week for him had he played this week. The one thing that I do like, we did see his utilization rate go down, and teammate O'Shan Allison has been getting more work over the last couple of weeks. But is there something that going on with Bangura that we don't know about? And has the bye week given him a chance to get right? If so, I think this will be a real pivotal week for you fantasy owners of Say Bangura. So I don't think it's time to dump him yet. You invested a high draft pick in him, and I think this is the week you're going to have to start him, ride or die this week. And then if it doesn't work out, you're going to have to make a decision then. Question number 2 from Large Arch 21. Donovan Edwards, worthless with healthy quorum, ? And, this was one of the situations that I wanted to touch on. So I'm glad this question came up because, even Mike told me, he gave me a shout in the morning and said, hey, look, even Harbaugh supposedly came out and said they're going to rotate these guys a little more often. They want to keep them fresh all the way through the end of the year. Well, my point is I think I'll believe it when I actually see it. Up until the point Michigan was winning 35-0 over Nebraska, Blake Corum had 16 carries. Donovan Edwards had 8. Now, that was more work than Edwards had been getting in the past, but you know what? It was already a 35-point game, and I still believe no matter what, Corum's going to get those goal line carries. So I still am in the camp right now where unless you're holding on to Edwards in a real deep league, maybe a Power 5 only league, or you have a deep roster and he's insurance for Blake Corum, I just don't see how you're starting Donovan Edwards now on a weekly basis in college fantasy football. Large Arch 21 came in with another question. What happened to Terrell Vaughn? And here's the question. I don't know. I just know that they were bracketing their coverage on him. He didn't even have a target in the game, which is very unusual. You're looking at, that's a player that was averaging 13 targets a game going into Saturday's matchup against UConn. But what I do know is that Jalen Royals, his teammate, he's caught a touchdown in 3 of the last 4. So you've got a nice little pivot if you want to go somewhere else, or at least there's a second option in that Utah State offense. But look, I think your question is the same question a lot of us have that have any shares of Terrell Vaughn, and that is, we'd like to know what happened. 0 targets for a guy that was averaging 13 targets per game. Really, really odd. He also asks, is Jalen Raynor for real? For real, for real. I think he is. And here's why I say this. Arkansas has been so bad under Butch Jones. And this was something Mike and I talked about at the beginning of the season. Is Butch Jones on the hot seat if he has another terrible season? This kid might actually be the savior that he needs to stay ahead of the, stay in charge of the program. Let's put into perspective a little bit about what Raynor has done, even though, look, it hasn't been against the best competition. But look, Arkansas State quarterbacks last year threw 16 touchdown passes and ran for 5 scores. Jalen Raynor, in his first 2 starts already, has accounted for 11 touchdowns, which is more than half of what the Arkansas State quarterbacks accounted for in all of last year. I do think Raynor's for real. He does play in the Sun Belt. He's going to have there's going to be some bumps in the road and some hiccups. But when you look at his numbers, I think that's a guy that you have to take right now. Signs are really positive. And with that type of production, look, you have to be pretty darn good to be able to put up some of the numbers that he put over the weekend. Large Arge also asks, Ashton Jeanty, top fantasy back in the land. Look, we had him as one of the top backs going into this week. As a matter of fact, I think we had him number 2 behind Rasheen Ali. And it's another topic that Mike and I talked about in the preseason. This was one of those backfield situations where if George Halani, if one of those backs went down, the other back was going to be a top 5 fantasy back in the country. That's what's happening right now with Ashton Jeanty. For you guys that have him, you just need George Halani to stay on the sidelines. How do we navigate the Washington State wide receiver room going forward? Well, look, that's a tough one, right? I mean, look, same thing can be said right now for the Washington receiver room, Tennessee receiver room. We could touch on all of those, but you've got Lincoln Victor right now. He's out. And you've got Josh Kelly, you've got Kyle Williams, you've got 2 more viable options. And when Victor comes back, I as long as he's healthy, I can see him putting similar numbers up that he posted before he went out with injury. But you're going to have 3 solid options in that offense. And the way that Ward is slinging it around, and for as good as Washington State looks right now, I think all 3 of those guys are viable options, even when Victor Kelly returns. What do we make of the the Western Kentucky offensive struggles? This one's interesting, because Austin Reed was a name that I was going to talk about. So I'm going to go ahead and bring it up while we're at this question. And so here's the deal. Austin Reed threw 4 TD passes this year against Houston Baptist. He has not thrown more than 2 TD passes in any of the 4 games in which he has played this year. When I watched this game this past weekend, what I saw him make some throws to some receivers that just don't quite have the hands that I think that he needs. I do think they're hurting at receiver right now. I mean, they have Malachi Corley. Dalvin Smith has been hurt. Honestly, I really don't know I don't think we really know how talented Dalvin Smith is. He was a 4th or 5th option last year in that offense. And then you have the freshman Easton Messer coming in. And so if you have a freshman coming in, that's their second most productive receiver right now, I think that's really telling on the depth of the Western Kentucky receiving room. And so when I look at some of the throws that were being made, I saw him make a couple of throws to Craig Burt Jr., to Barry, the receiver Barry, his last name. I just saw some guys that really didn't look like real good receivers. And I think receiver depth, quality of depth and talent at receiver is really what's hurting Western Kentucky right now. And like I said, when we get to this point, what you see is what you get. The one thing we really loved about Austin Reed at the beginning of the year was that we felt that offense was going to be really high powered and they were just going to steamroll opponents in that conference. We were actually worried about him not playing a full 4 quarters because we were worried about them rolling up such high numbers offense. The good news is that it doesn't look like they're as powerful as we thought they were going to be or as high octane, which means that Reed's probably going to be playing 4 quarters in most of these contests. The problem is the offense just isn't as efficient as we thought it would be. And so that's the struggles for Austin Reed. There were some people that were debating on whether or not to pick him over Caleb Williams for quarterback 1. There were some that would make a case to make him as quarterback 1 over Caleb Williams. It's not even close right now. And Austin Reed's not even quarterback 2 right now. I mean, we had this discussion earlier in the year. I had my doubts about North Carolina quarterback Drake May. Right now, I think you have to still feel good if you've got Austin Reed. I mean, I look, even he's finding the end zone on the ground as well. As long as if he can up those scores in the air from 2 to 3 per game and give you that occasional rushing game and get you around 300 yards, I think you'll be okay. And I think he's going to be right around that mark. But what's happening is he's behind last year's pace. And that's what that's where we're really, everything's relative to how he played and how he finished last year. And right now, at this point of the schedule, he's behind last year's numbers in regards to pace. And so that's why you feel you're not getting the value out of Austin Reed. And that's why I feel Western Kentucky is struggling right now. I just think the depth at receiver right now is really, really hurting them. So here we go. Let's go to a different question from a different Discord member. And Fire Guy 133 asks, what do you think about Marquise Crosby going forward? That's, of course, Louisiana Tech running back Marquise Crosby. Here's the deal. In the preseason, I was all over Marquise Crosby coming off of a big freshman campaign. I thought he was in for a really good year in that Louisiana Tech offense in the conference that they play. Hank Backmeyer has not been what I thought he would be for that Louisiana Tech offense. Still, that Tech offense has been banged up in the backfield from preseason camp all the way through the season, whether it's Tyree Shelton, whether it's, they've had a handful of backs. They've kind of had to patch that backfield together. Well, Marquise Crosby made his return this past week, had 1 carry for 20 yards. Where do I stand on Marquise Crosby right now? I still think you have to hold him right now. And I don't think you could start him. And here's why. Tyree Shelton is coming off of back-to-back 100-yard rushing games. I just don't see how the coaching staff makes a change in the backfield when they have a running back who has posted back-to-back 100-yard rushing games. I just don't think that ever really happens. I think you have to give Shelton every chance to hold down that spot if he's producing like that. And so I think even if you have Marquise Crosby right now, he's still going to play a back seat or a complementary role until Shelton proves that maybe he's not the true number 1. But after back-to-back 100-yard rushing games, Shelton, you would think, has to be the starter, at least going into their next matchup. Here comes a question from Jay Light. Is Squirrel White an ad coming off of last night's game and Brew McCoy's injury? That's a great question because Squirrel White had 9 receptions in Tennessee's win this past weekend. But here's the observation. They scored 5 touchdowns in that game. And we know we've been banging on the receivers all year. Ramel Caton's had the biggest year up until right now. They lose Brew McCoy. Squirrel White has 9 receptions. They score 5 touchdowns in that game. Not one of those touchdowns was scored by a receiver. Yeah, the tight end scored a touchdown, but technically he's not one of those big names that we were looking at in the preseason at receiver. I said it before. I'll say it again. I still think Squirrel White possesses the most upside in that wide receiver room. I'm just not convinced that there is going to be a consistent fantasy producer at receiver for Tennessee this year. And look, I said Milton was the one guy that I would want because I'm going to extend that same sentiment to the Tennessee backfield. Because at the beginning of the year, we had Jalen Wright and Jabari Small, and I can make a case that their offense was going to be good enough that both of those guys would be worth, some fantasy value. But then all of a sudden, you've got Dillon Sampson running in there. He's scoring touchdowns. He's rolling up yards. And with 3 backs in that backfield, it just feels like too much. It feels like too risky for me. I don't want any part of the Tennessee backfield. I don't want any part of the Tennessee receiving core right now. If I had to take a roll of the dice on one guy, I'd still probably keep Ramel Caton just because of his red zone presence, and he's the one scoring the touchdowns right now. But even after his 9 catches, Squirrel White still hasn't found an end zone this year and been on the receiving end of a touchdown. So I think he's got the most upside. But like I said, we're now going into week 6 of the regular season. You've got to hope one of these guys turn it on over the second half of the season, and that's the risk you have to take sometimes in college fantasy football. Squirrel White is the guy that you're going to be the high risk, high reward on. Ramel Caton at this point has sort of been the safety net, and right now in that backfield, it could be a different guy scoring every week. And I'm just telling you right now, Tennessee right now is just a nightmare and a headache for fantasy owners right now. And so I'm glad I don't have much fantasy stock in the Tennessee offense, but I can see where there's headaches all around. Let's see. ATL Gamecock asks, safe to drop Rodney Hammond at this point? I'm guessing most already have. And I have to say, I put this in my notes and observations. Rodney Hammond was a name that I was going to discuss, and I couldn't agree more. I feel like all my Rodney Hammond shares are worthless. Even teammate Sibo Flemster, had a decent game this past week in the Pitt backfield. We can talk about Rodney Hammond. I think the same thing applies to Austin Reed over at Western Kentucky. And this is going to actually lead into another player that I'm going to talk about as well, into Amarion Miller, the freshman receiver over at Colorado. We can play, the reason why I like Rodney Hammond so much at the beginning of the year is the system. I really love the Pitt system. We know what they did with Abanaconda and the numbers that he put up last year. Rodney Hammond had a good opener last year until he got hurt and Abanaconda took off and had that monster year. And then all of a sudden, look, I know they lose Keaton Slovis, and many didn't think Keaton Slovis was that good. Well, Keaton Slovis goes over to BYU. Pitt picks up Phil Jurkovec from BC, who has been absolutely terrible. The whole offense has been terrible. And so what you get is you have a system, but sometimes the personnel just isn't good enough for that system to be good that particular year. And we're seeing that right now at Pitt. And Rodney Hammond right now, for me, feels like a big loss, and I'm waving the white flag on him. I say the same thing because the system and personnel really has an effect, even when the coaching staff stays the same. And look at Austin Reed. We just had that discussion about him. He's behind last year's pace. And so I mentioned those guys because I think we have to look forward ahead. And here's some of the risk you actually take as well. And let's look at Amarion Miller, the freshman receiver for Colorado, who had 7 catches for 196 yards and a touchdown in that loss to USC. First of all, USC's defense isn't that good. It's almost as if USC wants teams to score so they can score more points. But here's another thought to keep in mind, too. Guys, should I pick him up for next year? Should I pick him up for next year? He looks like he would be the go-to receiver, and he very well may be. But here's the deal, right? Is Shedeur Sanders going to be there next year? If not, who's going to be their quarterback, right? Those are the things that play into it. And so it's like, okay, the system looks great. Miller looks like he may be a tremendous option for next year. But, does the system, what are the personnel in that system that turns over next year? And a quarterback's very important in that offense. And does Shedeur Sanders go pro? And who's the quarterback next year? So there's always risk in jumping on players, even in good systems, even if you think they're a keeper for next year, because the personnel, it's what makes college fantasy football so great, but it also makes it the biggest headache. And that is the turnover, the attrition, guys graduating and now transferring, right? The personnel is different on a year-to-year basis. And sometimes you lose out. Sometimes you hit it right. And sometimes you lose with a player. And that's where we're at with Rodney Hammond right now, because he certainly feels like I'm taking a big L on him this year. That's all right. I own it. That was the risk that I took with him. But look, I'm not afraid to say it. We hit some, we lose some, and that's the one I think has been my worst pick so far this year. ATL Gamecock X. One more question: is Le'Veon Moss officially the top guy in the A&M running back room? It was a mess early, but he seems to have separated himself. That's a really good question. I actually thought Le'Veon Moss was the number one receiver coming out of the previous game against Auburn when he went 15, 97 and 1. And I think after this performance against Arkansas, 17 carries, 107 yards, I think it's just solidified. I think Moss was the guy coming out of that Auburn matchup. But I think it's for sure he's definitely the running back one right there. Bobby Q Sauce asks, who is the best option for the rest of the season? Jalen Rayner, Zion Chris for Louisiana, or Braden Fowler Nicolosi from Colorado State? Good question. And this is a tough one because I tell you, a week ago, I would have probably had a different order. I think Jalen Rayner would have been at the bottom of that list. I think from the dual threat ability, if Ben Wooldridge is out long term, I really like Zion Chris. I would put him at the top of the list, especially going into next year. He looks really, really good. After Rayner seeing a second game, I kind of give him the edge at number 2 right now, but I feel like that can change with Braden Fowler, Nicolosi at any minute, and it also could change with scoring format as well. Any type of league that has 6-point passing touchdowns, then I could see where he may be in that second spot right there. But I think after last week's performance, Jalen Rayner might have jumped into that second spot for me. But for me, Chris is the one, and the other two, the second and third spot to me is a little fluid because, we don't have a big sample size on both Fowler, Nicolosi, and Rayner. But given what I've seen from Rayner and the history of that Arkansas State offense and what he's been able to do in 2 weeks, man, his stock certainly shot up after this past weekend. Baton Rouge Tigers ask, what do we do with Preston Stone? I have to tell you, I was really concerned with Preston Stone going into the last week's game. I thought Charlotte was one of the best teams on the board against the spread. They covered. We talked about the SMU offense a week ago. It looks like Kamar Wheaton was, I think, maybe banged up or something, which Jalen Knighton got to go on that. I just don't like the SMU offense right now. I'm not a big going into the season. I was high on Preston Stone and what that schedule in that conference could do for them. I just don't. When I look at SMU, I think of Western Kentucky as well. I just see an offense that just isn't quite clicking as much as we thought. And I don't think you can I think Preston Stone as a whole, I still think you're going to have some good matchups on the schedule, but I can see why that question's coming in because I don't think Stone has been what some thought he was going to be this year. Baton Rouge Tigers also asked, stock up on Andrew Armstrong with Haas, the tight end out at Arkansas. Offense didn't really get going yesterday, but he's likely to be the main guy catching passes now. Yeah, I mean, look, he has at least 75 receiving yards in 4 or 5 games this year. I still think something's not right in that Arkansas offense. They just got Raheem Sanders back. For me, I'm more concerned about Raheem Sanders fantasy owners right now and getting the value out of him where you drafted him at the beginning of the year. In order for that to happen, they're going to need some of these targets to emerge in the passing game. I think it actually hurts Sanders that a guy like Haas goes down at tight end because the fewer targets they have to throw the ball to, the more defense can just load up the box and stop that running game for Arkansas. So I think if you have Raheem Sanders, to see players like that go down does him no favors. But look, I can't argue with Armstrong not being the best option in the Arkansas passing game, but like I said, he's had at least 75 yards in 4 games this year. Just don't know if I really like him. I think PPR leagues, you're good, but I'm really concerned about him just being consistent on a week-to-week basis. Was the Vaughn Zonk a one-time thing or sign of things to come? X32 jet sweep. I did address the Vaughn issue already, and so I think we're good there. And so, like I said, he didn't have any targets this past weekend. And so let's see how that plays out going forward. or see if anything comes out that maybe something was wrong with him. I'm not particularly sure, but we're going to find out. Another question. Let's see. Bedtime 37 asks, can Anthony Grant be the guy in the Nebraska backfield? Well, you know what I think? I think he has to be at this particular point. They've lost so many players. I think Grant has to be the guy in the Nebraska backfield. Quite honestly, Grant was probably the most talented player in the Nebraska backfield going into the season. The problem was coming out of camp, there were issues with him maybe putting the ball on the turf, and we saw that monster reared its ugly head in the opener against Minnesota, where his fumble late in the game really probably cost Nebraska that ball game, even on top of the mistakes that Jeff Sims made in that room. They still in that game, they still had a chance to win, and Grant put the ball on the ground. But look, he's the most talented back probably on the roster, at least right now. He's going to get his opportunities because, quite frankly, injuries have caused guys to go down, and he's the best man available. Barbecue Sauce asks, who do you think will emerge as the leader in the Tennessee running back room? I addressed that one out already. I don't know if we're going to see a leader in the running back room. I just think we've got a three-headed monster, and that's the way that it's going to be for the rest of the year. And so CU Tiger asks, he gets one right under the bell. Does Jaya Wright keep the job after his performance this past weekend? I don't know. That's why. Will he? I'm not sure. I think he will. But look, anything can happen when you're talking about these programs, and that's just one where you're kind of roll the dice week in and week out. So that would be my assumption to on Jaya Wright moving forward. So that takes care of the Discord questions, but look, there's still some that I want to address. Let's talk. I throw out Dillon Gabriel's name at the beginning of the podcast, Oklahoma. I have to admit, I was off on Dillon Gabriel. Last year, he finished the year with 24 passing touchdowns, 5 rushing touchdowns through 5 games this year. He's already thrown 15 touchdown passes and ran 4 for 4 touchdowns. He's well ahead of last year's pace. And he's actually, so much we were making so much out of who to have in that Oklahoma backfield in the preseason in that Jeff Lebby offense. Right now, Dillon Gabriel's the guy that you want to have. He's got 4 rushing touchdowns, 15 passing touchdowns, has absolutely been lighting it up. I was concerned about him when he got into conference play, but I have pivoted after last week's performance. I've pivoted the opposite way on Dillon Gabriel, and I'm a lot more bullish on him than I was just a couple of weeks ago. I thought he was just a guy that was going to run through non-conference schedule. I think you're going to be okay with Dillon Gabriel, and he's going to be really solid all year long, and he's going to surpass last year's numbers pretty easily as long as he stays healthy. And while I am on that pivoting point, I think we have to go to Ray Davis over at Kentucky, because just a week ago, I was suggesting that maybe, just maybe, you parlay that early season success for Ray Davis into a really solid trade in your favor with the schedule that they had coming up. And then all of a sudden he explodes for 280 yards and scores 4 TDs in that win over Florida. And now when I look at the schedule and you look at games like LSU, Ole Miss, and you look at Alabama, Mississippi State, you just wonder, there just aren't no dominant defenses that are really going to come up anyway. Is any game really a bad game on that schedule? Maybe with the exception of Georgia. And so right now, I've pivoted on Ray Davis, and I think he's a keeper now. I think you've got to keep him moving forward. Let's talk about Marquez Cooper, Ball State running back, because I thought last week was a pivotal week for him. And he ran up 136 total yards of offense, 82 on the ground. He had 54 receiving. I have to tell you, I was really, really on the fence about Marquez Cooper. And my mistake about Marquez Cooper, and this is something Mike and I talk about at the beginning of the year to give you a little insight on how we rank guys in the preseason. My mistake was I think I ranked Marquez Cooper too high because of this. And I say that because of the schedule. Because what happens is, they were playing Kentucky at the beginning of the year. We weren't expecting to get much out of them. But when you look at Carson Steele's numbers at Ball State over the last couple of years, you really see how that offense can really, really just plug that running back in, and that value would have certainly been reached had he been able to stay at somewhat that pace. But that hasn't happened. The personnel just isn't there for Ball State, right? And so another personnel question. And the thing you have to realize as well, and getting back to the preseason ranking, usually I'm pretty careful on ranking guys too high when they're in a group of five, when they're on a group of five roster and they have a tough Power 5 schedule, non-conference schedule. And here's why. Because we put so much stock into the first quarter, the first third of the season. Because if you start out 0-3, you're already behind the 8 ball, and you almost have to win, 6 out of 8 just to have a shot at making the playoffs if you're starting out behind the 8 ball. And so I'm really careful on ranking guys too high that have a hard non-conference schedule. Marquez Cooper, I didn't do that because I felt really comfortable given his heavy workload at Kent State over the past 2 years. And the staff never changed at Ball State. They just lost Carson Steele to UCLA, and he was coming in. Cooper's shown that he can carry that type of load. However, the personnel is just different. And Cooper does not get the same support in that system that Steele was getting last year. And so for that reason, for sure, I know that I'll really be careful going into next year, because I went against the grain on Marquez Cooper in my preseason ranking, putting him in the top 10, when traditionally a player in a group of 5 school that plays that type of a non-conference schedule, knowing that you're not going to get 2 good outings out of him, I usually don't put him in the top 10, and I did. It was good to see him get 136 total yards in that matchup against Western Kentucky, but I have to tell you, I'm still concerned. They played Western Kentucky, and he still didn't find the end zone. That is concerning to me. I do think he is a start moving forward, but man, he's got to find the end zone from here on out. 1 rushing touchdown through this point of the season is just not going to do it. He has to find the end zone to start making him worth something in your fantasy roster. And then let's talk about another guy that has just exploded over the last couple of weeks. He has scored this year. Texas State running back Ismail Mahdi. And I think that's how you say the last name. I think he was born in Kenya. He's a speedster. Look, he's got 7 rushing touchdowns this year. He's got a touchdown receiver, and he's got a touchdown returning. He ran a kickback this past weekend. In the past 2 games, he's carried the ball, 35 times for over 300 yards and scored 5 touchdowns. He's had 14 carries and 21 carries in back-to-back games. He's established himself as that go-to back in that Texas State offense. And quite honestly, I talked about Ashton Hawkins, I think a week ago, saying I wasn't really concerned. I wasn't really sold on Ashton Hawkins, that they were spreading the ball around other than TJ Finley. I wasn't that high on any one particular player in that Texas State offense, but Ismail Mahdi was still on the radar because of the way that he was scoring. And now he is undoubtedly the second best option if TJ Finley is the best option in that offense. And I can make a case based on your depth at quarterback that maybe Ismail Mahdi is actually the best fantasy option on that Texas State roster. But right now, Finley and Mahdi are the 2 top choices in that Texas State offense, and he should certainly be on fantasy rosters right now. The one other thing that I wanted to talk about was just the point on Amarion Miller as well that I mentioned earlier in the show, and that was that freshman receiver coming in. Keep in mind, you still have Travis Hunter that comes back. Xavier Weaver is a little banged up. There's a lot of receivers that Colorado has. This was a really great performance by a young receiver, but this I have to tell you, I was actually impressed. I thought he really looked good on the field too, with some of the catches that he made, the way that he made those catches. There's just so many balls that are going to go in the air at Colorado. And I think the big 3 when Hunter comes back is it's going to be Hunter, it's going to be Weaver, it's going to be Horn. Now, here's the one thing that we have to keep in mind, and this is why I do think Amarion Miller is valuable moving forward. One, I've been saying this since the preseason. You have to worry about injuries. Injuries can boost the stock of other players instantly. We're seeing that right now, right? With guys like Ashton Genty over at Boise State with George Helani going down. We'll see it at Michigan if, either Corum or Edwards goes down. We'll see it at Penn State probably if Singleton or Allen go down, right? Like there's systems that are just made that if a guy, there's so much talent there that if one goes down, it boosts the stock of others, right? I mean, we saw that when McMillan went out, Jalen Polk's stock shot through the roof in that Washington offense. So here's one point that I'll make, particularly now that Colorado has lost 2 games and Travis Hunter will miss, I think, 3 games. I don't think you're going to see any conversation with him about Heisman. Now the injury bug has hit him, and you really have to start worrying about, okay, he can't be banged up. The 2 playing him both ways, is it worth doing it right now? And I think what could happen over the course of the next 2 or 3 games, if Colorado loses another game or 2, is you may see Travis Hunter not play offense anymore, and they may try to preserve him and save him and protect him from injury, knowing they have these other guys that can catch passes and they can develop them for next year. And I think that's really something that you need to keep an eye on. Mike and I were having a conversation, with LSU losing another game. I think that puts LSU out of the conversation, even though they're not probably technically eliminated from the SEC title run. But when these big teams with really good players start dropping games, you have to then start wondering if some of the bigger names are going to start scaling back their playing time or decide to opt out of the season. We are getting close to that point with some of these teams. We've seen it already where guys are backing out, they're redshirting, preserving it. They're already, planning on transfers. We're getting a little bit of that coming in already. Wouldn't be surprised to see more of that come out in the next couple of weeks. I mean, there was a question coming in about Alton McCaskill as well over at Colorado, because we can talk about that. I don't really think you're going to see Alton McCaskill get a heavy workload in Colorado. You got Hankerson there. You got Edwards, the freshman. Personally, if I'm Colorado, I want to give Edwards as many touches as possible. I don't care if he's the smaller back. He definitely is the most dynamic back that they have on that roster. And if I were them, I'd be giving him the ball more. I don't think Alton McCaskill right now is even worth anything on a roster right now for Colorado. So that's sort of my thoughts around some of the players' potential, things we have to look out for in the coming weeks. Remember, it used to be the bowl games that we were worried about guys opting out and not playing and worried about getting injured. I think we're going to start seeing that, and we have over the last year or two, guys starting to opt out in the regular season once when their teams are mathematically eliminated from any type of a conference race. I think you may see some guys head out, or guys that may miss 2 or 3 games for injury. Maybe they, decide that they want to transfer because, they've missed 2 or 3 games, and there's guys that made their way up the depth chart and playing in front of them now, and maybe they may go elsewhere or try to get a quick payday at another school in an offseason by hitting the transfer portal. So that's my thoughts. That's week 5 for me in a nutshell. Those are my thoughts, my observations, and how I tackle some of those questions in the Discord. Hope that helped. We're halfway done. The 2 halves tournament is down to the first half final. All the brackets are updated. The eliminator is down to 80 teams. So if you are in the 4-1 Super Fantasy League, there's a lot of league left. The head-to-head tournament still has about 48 teams left in it. So if you're in the 4-1 Super Fantasy League, don't forget to clear those rosters this week. Games start on Wednesday this week. If you're paying attention on the website, I'm going to have the Wednesday projections up for the Wednesday game, but the rest of the week will not be up until Thursday. That's the regular day we get the projections. I'll try to get the projections up on Wednesday for you guys looking to do something with DFS, playing DFS on a Wednesday night. So look out for those 2-game projections on the website on Wednesday. And then, of course, the waiver wire is going to be coming as well by the time that this gets posted, and the projections, all of Mike's write-ups for the weekends, we'll start pounding that stuff out over the second half of the week. But that's going to do it for the week 5 show, guys. We're halfway done through the season after this week. And for a lot of you guys, more than halfway through the college fantasy football season. So Good luck to everyone going into a pivotal week 6, and I'll see you on next week's podcast. Till then, good luck, guys.